Hello, and thank you for joining. This is our From Dubai review of the new Sony A6700. And when I say From Dubai review, I hope you get the significance. Because if this camera will ever overheat, it is here and now that it will. And it did. But there is more to that than just a camera overheating. More on that in just a little bit. If you don't know who we are TechMission. We are the leading Arabic-speaking camera and gear channel in the Arab world. Here, we are publishing in English, targeting you, expats who live in the region, in the GCC region, and people who speak English worldwide. So, if you like us, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Help us achieve in English what we have achieved in Arabic. This camera, as you may have heard, is basically an FX30 sensor with A7R5 processor, AI chip, and autofocus system in a completely redesigned body for Sony's APS-C lineup. This camera comes after 4 whole years of the last Sony APS-C camera, the Sony A6600. Back then, I reviewed that camera, and I called it the best APS-C camera, hands down, of that time. And it was. In fact, it was my main driver for a long while, after my first mirrorless camera, which was the Sony A6300. From A6600, I went to A7 III, and I have been shooting full frame since then, till this camera arrived. A lot has changed since those years where Sony was the only king of the mirrorless world. Today, this camera stands against successful devices, successful competition, such as the Canon EOS R7, and one that I am particularly impressed with, which is the Fujifilm X-H2S. Lately, I have been playing with the XS20 from Fujifilm as well, and it also stands on its own. So we have high competition for the A6700 before we can crown it in the APS-C domain. Is going to make it? As we say in our Arabic channel, تابعونا. So, we are talking about Sony A6700. Sony has done it again. In their consumer and upscale consumer lineup, they always create a combination of two important things. On one side, it is feature-rich. Not too much though. We don't have that aggressive 6.2K output to HDMI, for example, like we see in the Fujifilm lineup. We have rich features that are just enough for the target audience and nothing more. On the other hand, it is also easy to use with the new menus, the new on-screen buttons, the FN menu that we know from Sony, the customization that happens all around the camera. This is a very easy to use camera, even for beginners. One thing that is worth mentioning before we carry on is that Sony is saying that this is still not their flagship APS-C camera. To me, this statement means that we are to expect an A7000 camera sometime within next year. Surely with an upgraded viewfinder and a screen, and possibly, or hopefully, if I am to be truthful, with a stacked sensor, like the one we saw in the Fujifilm X-H2S, and it made a huge difference. But that's just a speculation. So until then, let's talk about this camera. And let's start with the design and features. And we have a lot to say here. We have many new design elements, and almost everything has changed, even if slightly, except for the viewfinder, which is still similar to older Sony APS-C cameras. It is on the side, smaller, and not exactly comfortable. it gets the job done, I guess.
In size, the camera is closer to Sony A7C, but with a bigger grip, which is better and more comfortable. In general looks, it's not very different from other Sony cameras, but in details, we have many new elements. Something that has not changed is the shutter button and the on-off switch. Here, we have the video recording button in a convenient location as opposed to the awkward placement Sony APS-C cameras used to have in the past. Of course, the awkward place is still there, but instead of the video recording button, it is a C1 button. For the first time in any Sony crop sensor camera, or any Sony camera with a smaller form factor for that matter, we have two dials, one in the front and one in the back. This is especially important for me, and I wish Sony did the same for the full-frame ZV-E1, for example. Here we have the mode dial. It is simple, not at all crowded, and I like that. Under the mode dial, we have the very well-placed photo, video, and SNQ switch. This is something that we have been seeing since Sony A7 IV, and I love it. The implementation in this camera is just perfect. In the front, we have the sensor, very cool branding, and 2 out of 3 microphone capsules. Autofocus assist lamp is here. From the back, we have a 3-inch LCD screen, 1 million dots. Not exactly super, but adequate. I hoped for a higher resolution screen, to be frank, especially that at the same time of testing this camera, I had been testing the Fujifilm XS20 with 1,840,000 dots, and this makes a big difference. Brightness is okay, however. I tested it in my trip to Muscat. Not excellent, but okay. On top of the screen and on the side, we have the awkward viewfinder that I talked about. What I said about the screen still applies here as well. It is a poor 2.36 million dots, but with a very good performance. It has high refresh rate and good viewing angle of 33 degrees. Button layout is not much different from any other Sony camera, but we don't have a joystick like full-frame cameras. I wish we did. Inside the grip, we have the Sony MP-FZ100 battery, the same high-performing battery that we see in all Sony full-frame cameras nowadays. Next to the battery, and unlike previous generations, we do not have a memory card slot. The memory card slot is now in a much better place right here behind this door. The camera takes a single SD card and supports UHS 2 in high speeds up to V90. In ports, we have a 3.5 microphone jack, USB Type-C for charging, data and power delivery, and an HDMI micro. We also have a 3.5 headphone jack for monitoring. The camera is comfortable in the hand, it's not too small, not too big, easy to use, beautiful, and I loved using it.
Let's talk about the sensor a little bit. It is a 26 megapixel backside illuminated Exmor CMOS APS-C size sensor. It is the same sensor that we saw in the Sony FX30. I owned the FX30 for a while and I ended up selling it and replacing it with the Sony ZV-E1 when the ZV-E1 came out. But I was impressed always with the performance of that camera for as long as I owned it. And I even traveled with it to Georgia, one time only, as my main video camera in addition to Alpha 1 as my main photo camera. And it impressed me over and over again. That camera did great in video, but it didn't do so much in photo because it is not designed for photo. It does not have the mechanical shutter. It does not have the ergonomics for photography. So I didn't even take a single photo with that camera. Now with this camera, we are photo oriented. So the sensor has always done well in the FX30. I did the review of that camera in Arabic, and you can see it on our Arabic channel if you are interested and if you speak Arabic. But I can tell you the summary of that is that the sensor did great in everything. The only thing that I have to say about that sensor is that when it comes to shooting S-Log3 in particular, you have to be careful with your exposure because it is not as forgiving in post-editing as, say, the FX3 or A7 IV because of the smaller sensor. So if you are shooting S-Log3, do by all means, but be very careful about your exposure, again, because it is not as forgiving. But it will still yield the same great results, so don't get me wrong. Just be more careful with your exposure. Supporting the sensor, we have the BIONZ XR image processor that we saw in Sony A7R5, a camera that is double the price of this one. And this is a great processor. It is in fact Sony's top-of-the-range processor at the moment. Along with this processor, we get the new AI chip that we also saw in the A7R5, a camera again double the price of this one. This AI chip is specifically designed for autofocus, which means that we get the most advanced autofocus Sony has to offer today. And it is in fact very advanced. We have the subject detection for human, animal, birds, cars, trains, planes, and even insects. And trust me, it does well with all those modes. The main difference between this autofocus system and the older human eye, bird eye, animal eye autofocus is that here we are using artificial intelligence to identify the shape of an animal or a human or a bird or a car or anything else. So it does not necessarily need to see the face or the eye to autofocus. It can focus on the human shape, even from the back, and even if we cannot really tell where the face is or where the eye is for that matter, as you can see in these examples in front of you that were shot on the A6700. Look at this example in particular. The camera found the cat, focused on the cat automatically, although it occupies a very, very small area in the frame. And I got the picture. It was impressive that the camera did the job for me. Of course, being a cropped sensor, we have an advantage, and the same advantage is a disadvantage. A cropped sensor, as you know, imposes a 1.5 crop factor. So a lens that is a 30 millimeters would behave like a 45 millimeters. A 20 millimeters would behave like a 30, a 50 like a 75, and so on. This means that on the wider side of things, a wide-angle lens like the 18mm, for example, would behave like a 27mm, which is not so wide. Even an ultra-wide 14mm would behave like a 24mm. This is a disadvantage of a crop sensor camera. However, on the other side of things, if you mount a 600mm on this camera, you will get a 900mm equivalent. And that's without cropping on your sensor. So you're getting the full resolution, you're not losing dynamic range, you're not losing anything. And this is just great for wildlife photography and other types of photography like sports photography, etc. So you are extending your reach from 600 to 900 without losing anything. To me, in between this advantage and this disadvantage, it is your choice. It depends on what you shoot and how you shoot. If you are buying the camera for family photography, for travel photography, for casual photography, it's absolutely perfect and there is nothing that you will miss because you don't need the ultra-wide anyway. But if you need the ultra-wide, like if you are into architecture, if you are into real estate, then definitely full frame is the one for you. And this is not the one for you at all.
We have the new Sony menus in their latest version. We have the tile menus, which change in photo and video modes. Absolutely helpful as they give us quick access to everything that we need to change on the spot. We also have easy buttons on the screen, which appear and disappear with a simple swipe. And between these menus, tile menus, custom menus, and function menu, we can customize the camera our own way. And we would never need to dive into the real menu ever again.
This camera shoots 11 frames per second with a mechanical shutter. And with the electronic shutter, it shoots 11 frames per second. I have no idea why Sony did this. It is the same if you're shooting mechanical or electronic, it's the same frame count. So I don't see any real value of shooting electronic shutter and risking the definitely there rolling shutter. Some might say that the electronic shutter will help you take rid of the shutter shock. I didn't notice any shutter shock in this camera, but maybe I'm still to test about that. Possibly. If you need the camera to be silent, then definitely. But apart from this, I don't see the value of shooting electronic at all. And speaking of burst, the buffer is very good. We have the faster SD card, we have the new processor, and the new sensor. Between these, we are getting 59 lossless compressed RAW before the buffer is full, and much more in JPEG, of course. Speaking of RAW, we have lossless compressed and compressed, and we don't have the option to shoot non-compressed RAW. To me, that's not a big deal at all because I shoot lossless compressed anyway, even on my Alpha 1. So I wouldn't mind not having uncompressed. But if you do mind, then this camera may not be for you. In video, we have 4K 60, 422 10-bit, and we have 4K 120 as well if you need that. But the 4K 120 is A, cropped, and B, non-oversampled. So you will lose not only the field of view, but also some of the quality. So because of that, my advice is to shoot 4K up to 60, unless you absolutely need the extra slow motion of the 4K 120. In 4K 60, you will get non-cropped, oversampled image, and it's absolutely beautiful. And also, it is 422 10-bit, of course. 24, 25, 30, and 50 are also 422 10-bit, non-cropped, and oversampled. So you are good with any of those frame rates. And of course, like any other Sony camera nowadays, we have S-Log3 and S-Cinetone, among others, which is very important. To me, this camera should be shot in S-Cinetone. Again, I'll repeat what I said a little bit earlier. If you shoot S-Log3, you will get excellent footage, but you have to be extra careful with your exposure because it is not as forgiving in post-processing as the FX3 or any other full-frame Sony camera today. In addition to these video features, and to enable you to use this camera with the upscale GM lenses, this camera comes with the focus breathing compensation feature, a feature that we saw first in the Sony A7 IV, and we are seeing it in more and more Sony cameras today. Focus breathing compensation is a feature that crops a little bit into the sensor, into the frame, to take rid of the focus breathing, which is the slight change in zoom or in field of view when changing the focus. This is a natural phenomenon in every lens, and it's virtually impossible to take rid of it in any lens. Sony GM lenses suffer from this quite heavily. Every Sony GM lens that I tested had heavy focus breathing. To solve this, Sony applied focus breathing compensation. Here's an example. This is a footage without the feature. You can clearly see the change in zoom or the change in frame when the focus changes. Now we have applied the feature, and you can see the focus change is still very smooth, but there is no change in the frame itself. There's a small crop though, but that's a small price in my opinion to pay for fixing the breathing issue and having this nice focus pulse that you are looking for. Let's talk overheating. Yes, the camera did overheat. But as I told you, there's more to that story than simply a camera overheating. The situation was as follows. I went down to Muscat to shoot some samples for this camera and for some other lenses that I'm reviewing. It was really humid, which of course results in fogging on the sensor and the lenses every time I took the gear from the AC compartment of my truck. To solve this problem, I had only one option. I had to leave the gear in the trunk under direct sunlight. Well, not direct sunlight because I have the tonneau cover, but it's a black car and they were under the sun in the trunk, accumulating heat under 38, 39 degrees Celsius all day long, accumulating heat, and then I finally reached the destination where I am supposed to be shooting. I shoot for over half an hour in 4K 60 internally, outputting 4K 60 to Atomos as well. After about half an hour or a little bit more, I got the heat warning. 5 minutes later, the camera shut down. So as you see, if the camera overheated, it had every right to overheat. I don't mind telling you, I myself overheated and shut down as well, just slightly after that. Apart from this incident, I shot around Muscat within the same conditions with the camera and the rest of the gear in the trunk of my truck, under direct sunlight, absorbing heat all day long. I shot video, I shot photo, I shot 4K 60, I shot 4K 120, I shot all my test shots, and the camera never overheated, never even gave me a warning. So I don't suppose that this camera has an overheating problem. It overheated only when it was reasonable for it to overheat, which is the situation that I mentioned earlier. When it comes to the internal microphone, we have a different implementation as well. We have two capsules around the lens mount and one on the top, instead of one big capsule or the three capsules being together on top. It works well, it gives you good results. But if you are shooting with a camera like this, I would say use an external microphone. Not that there is anything wrong with the internal microphone. On the contrary, it's absolutely fine. But shooting with a camera like this with these capabilities, I would say use an external microphone and get the even better results, especially if you are shooting from far away from this camera. Now let's talk lenses. Of course, this is an APS-C camera, so you get to use the cheaper, smaller, and easier to handle APS-C lenses. We have plenty of options from Sony and third-party providers. From Sony, we get the magnificent 1655 f2.8G lens. It's a great lens, but it is as expensive as a GM lens. So I don't really see the value of buying that. To me, the Tamron 17-70 is the golden lens for the APS-C Sony lineup. This is just absolutely fantastic in everything that you may test. It gives you roughly the equivalent of 25.5 to 105, which is a very good range, making it very versatile. With a constant f2.8, I actually tested that lens and I reviewed it, and you can see the review on the Arabic channel. It is an absolutely fantastic lens in sharpness, in optical performance in general, and also in autofocus, much better than any other third-party lens that I have tested. So I would say get that lens, and it is a one lens to rule them all. But there's also other options in APS-C lenses. And you can actually also use full-frame lenses, including Sony's Premium GM. I personally shot with this camera with the 24 f1.4 G Master lens and the 7200 f2.8 Mark II G Master lens during my Muscat trip, and I was very, very happy with the combination. So, who is this camera for? I think it is for pretty much everybody. If you're a hobbyist just coming into photography, this is perfect for you. If you're coming back to photography like I did in 2016 after a long pause, this is perfect for you. If you're an advanced hobbyist and you want a camera with excellent features and excellent image quality, this camera is for you. And if you are buying a camera for family photography, for travel photography, for casual shooting, then this camera is also for you. Even if you are a professional and you want a camera B, this is perfect for you. And even if you are a professional and you need a camera A, a main camera, and you cannot afford full frame glass and full frame bodies, then yes, this camera is also for you. It actually serves many, many purposes, and it is one of the top in this domain. Let's think a little bit about the competition. We have the Canon EOS R7, Fujifilm X-H2S, and the Sony A6700. Very soon I'll put the three head-to-head, and I'll be able to tell you which one is the one that rules the APS-C domain today. Thank you for watching this review. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope it was helpful for you. If you like our videos in English, show us some support by subscribing to this channel and liking and sharing this video. And as for me, I'll see you in the next video. And cut!